interactive learning experiences can help build confidence by allowing dairy workers to actively participate in their own training. Interactive training methods such as group activities, simulations, games, or other hands-on methods keep employees engaged in the learning process and create a safe space for questions. Next on the webinar, Jennifer Van Oss will share the importance of proper cow handling and a revolutionary way to practice. In collaboration with Wisconsin dairy stakeholders, Jennifer created an innovative learning tool for people to practice the appropriate handling of dairy cows. Moving Cows is a digital, serious game where players practice appropriate cow handling skills in the routine milking parlor and freestyle pen environments. Without the cows, with the digital, serious game, learners practice moving cows in simulated dairy farm environments. Like a flight simulator, the game is a way for participants to learn by doing, to understand how human actions affect cow behavior, stress, productivity, and worker safety. Dr. Van Oss is an assistant professor and extension specialist in animal welfare on the faculty of UW-Madison's Department of Animal and Dairy Science and the Division of Extension, respectively. Jennifer received her PhD in the Interdisciplinary Animal Behavior Graduate Program at the University of California, Davis, and conducted postdoctoral research in animal welfare at the University of British Columbia. The current research and in her lab at UW-Madison focuses on understanding, evaluating, and improving the welfare of dairy animals from biological and social science perspectives. And thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today, and let's learn more about moving cows.
Thank you so much, Erica. I'm glad to be here today. And so I will just give a caveat that I have a number of videos to share. And if my internet connection doesn't seem to be cooperating, I will post some of these on my website after the fact. So I have some examples of the video game. So going back to what Jim said about making the business case for training, I want to talk about why I think cow handling is a topic that does require not just onboarding training, but annual refresher or continuing education. So when I moved here to Wisconsin over 5 years ago and started to get established as an extension specialist in dairy cattle welfare, I met with a number of Wisconsin dairy farm owners and others in the industry to ask them what did they perceive to be their challenges around animal welfare and animal care, and how could my applied research program help? And it was very interesting that one of the topics that kept rising to the top was training on cow handling. So dairy farm owners were asking me, can you please come to my farm and train my staff on the appropriate practices to use? And they were expressing this need. And on one hand, that wasn't surprising because we know that cow handling is really essential to the dairy farm. But it also surprised me a bit because there already are a number of training tools out there. So the research has shown that with proper training on cow handling practices, we can reduce the risk of injuries to the people who work with cows and the risk of injuries to the cows themselves. And we know that with proper handling, we can minimize the cow's stress levels, which leads to improved flow in the milking parlor, so milking parlor throughput and efficiency, as well as increased milk yield. And we also have some recent evidence from my own group that proper cow handling can help us maintain consumer confidence or public trust. So I just want to take a bit of a tangent and talk about that last point a little bit further. So we currently have a paper in press in the Journal of Dairy Science based on a survey study that we conducted. And our objective was to compare the perceptions of two different populations on a range of realistic cow handling situations on dairy farms. So we recruited a sample of Wisconsin general public participants, meaning they weren't involved in the dairy industry. And we recruited them through an online marketing company to make sure that they were demographically representative of the US population in terms of their age, gender, educational attainment, and family income levels. And then separately, we invited members of the US dairy industry to participate. So this included dairy farmers, farm managers, some animal welfare scientists and other animal scientists, veterinarians, consultants, other people who work directly with the dairy industry in the US. And we showed them a series of 12 video clips in a randomized order that depicted this range of realistic situations of routine cow handling. And so we have an external advisory group on this project, and they gave us some feedback to make sure that we had this range from positive to negative interactions. So we had 4 types of interactions that were positive or neutral, 4 which the research would suggest is moderately negative from the cow's perspective, and then 4 that were more negative. And we wanted to see what people thought of these practices. So I'm just going to jump ahead to the results. And just to orient you to what these graphs are showing, on the left, you have those people from the Wisconsin general public. On the right, you have the graph for people from the US dairy industry. And what this is showing is the ranking of these 12 videos clips from the most positive to the most negative. So that's this first column. So that's how people reacted to them. And then the second set of questions was about what do you think the cow is experiencing in this situation? And again, the ranking is from most positive to most negative. We also asked people, how did you feel when you were watching this video clip? So again, from most positive to negative. And then lastly, we asked them, how common do you think this type of interaction is on dairy farms in the US? So they're ranked from most to least common. So when you're looking at these graphs, the line connects any given video. And so you can see a pattern which emerged, which was that in general, people thought that practices which they viewed as more positive, they also thought were more common. And that was the case both for the general public and people within the industry. And in general, the rankings between the two populations were really similar. So 2 take-home messages are, people don't think that negative practices or animal abuse are rampant within the industry. They think that those practices are very negative, but that they're very uncommon. And also, these 2 different populations had generally similar perceptions. So it's not that the general public thinks that people in the industry are doing things that are unacceptable, whereas people in the industry think certain negative practices are okay. In general, the 2 populations perceive different cow handling situations similarly. And actually, in some cases, the industry was more critical. So I will just dive into a couple of those examples. So there are some videos here, and I apologize if they're not streaming very smoothly on your end, but this is an example of what we classified as a positive interaction. And so everybody saw this video and they were given a little bit of text just for context. And they were told, this worker is removing the cows from this pen so that he can do some repairs in the barn. And you can see as he's moving the cows, there's no physical contact. He's not making any noises. So this is very gentle, low stress handling. So to orient you to the results at the top, again, it's these 4 categories. So how did you feel about this video? And we classified this into negative, neutral, or positive. What do you think the cow thought of this interaction? Was it negative, neutral, or positive? How did you feel when you were watching it? And how common did you think this was? Uncommon, common, or somewhere in between? And then the top bar is the dairy industry professional population. And then the second section here is for the general public. And so if you see a lot of blue, that means positive perceptions and the action was perceived as common. And so the story for this particular video clip is that the 2 groups pretty much thought the same thing, that this was a positive interaction and that this was very common. What's interesting is when we get into some of these mildly negative or in-between scenarios. So in this example, people were told that this worker is removing the cows from the pen because it's time for milking. And what you can see is that he's behaving more agitated than we would like. So he's waving his arms, clapping his hands, doing a little bit of shouting. And so based on the animal welfare research, we would expect the cows to perceive this kind of action as negative. So indeed, if you look at under column B, this top line, the majority of people in the dairy industry said the cow would find this to be negative, and they thought that it was negative when they viewed this video. What was interesting was that if you look at the second row, members of the public tended to think that cows might think this was positive and that they reacted positively. So it was actually the opposite of what we expected. And so we thought that this was because people in the industry are educated about the animal welfare research, and they know that cows don't like yelling or sudden movements and this kind of thing. So they're actually more aware of the cow's perspective. But then if you look at this last column, column D, both groups thought this type of action was common on US dairy farms. So that suggests some room for improvement in terms of the cow handling practices that are actually being used. In this example video, you can see this cow is lying in a free stall. Her rear end and her udder are kind of hanging off the end. So clearly there's something possibly wrong with her. And so people were told in this video, this worker is checking to see if this cow is non-ambulatory, and that's why he's slapping her. And so if you look at the industry's reactions, which are this top row, you can see that most of them, about 52%, thought that the cow's experience was negative. And I'm sorry, I put 49% at the top. It's 52%. But 62% of them had a positive attitude towards the video. And so the way we interpreted this was, even though people in the industry recognized that the cow might have experienced this as negative, they thought that this practice was acceptable given this context, this larger context of healthcare, and needed to make sure that this cow could actually get up. And on the other hand, we thought that the public might have been uncertain about what the cow was experiencing. So you can see some of them thought it might be negative, a large number were neutral, and some thought it might actually be positive for the cow. And then I'm just going to share one more example. So in this video, people were told that these cows were in a special treatment pen and that they might be non-ambulatory. So this worker is checking to see if they can get up, but using an electric prod. So we expected people to view this scenario very negatively. And I will say, actually, the electric prod was turned off. So this was staged. And you can see on the most part, people thought that this was negative. They thought the cow experienced it as negative. But what was interesting is if you look at the public versus the industry sample, there's more people in the general public that thought that cow might experience this as positive, which was a bit strange. So again, we thought it might be that people within the industry are actually more aware of the research on cows and what they experience, and people in the general public may be more uncertain about whether cows actually can feel pain or fear. But another take-home message from this video is that a number of people in the industry and in the general public thought this type of behavior was common. So again, this suggests a potential risk for exposure through undercover activist videos and potentially room for improvement if this type of behavior is in fact common. So the take-home message here is overall pretty good news for the industry. People in the general public don't think that we're just rampantly mistreating cows, but there's potentially room for improvement because people perceive that more negative actions are less common, yet at the same time, they're more common than maybe we would like. A few years ago, a study was done by the USDA, and it revealed that training on cow handling hasn't been universal. So we know, again, there's probably opportunity for improvement for implementing education on this topic. So at that time, there was an estimate that only about half of dairy farms in the US provided training on this topic. And a separate survey from University of Minnesota asked dairy farmers, well, what are the barriers to providing training? And some of the common themes which emerged were a lack of time, which I think people can really relate to on the farm, a lack of resources, which I thought was interesting, and also language barriers. So we know there's been a big demographic shift in the dairy workforce in the upper Midwest and elsewhere in the US in the last few years. So sometimes owners or managers don't speak the same language as much of their workforce. So in terms of lack of resources, these could be tied together. We know there are a number of educational resources available, many of them very well produced with good information and even free. But I think language is part of the limitation there. And then it could also be that people see other limitations with these resources. So it could be what Jim described, where many of these resources are what are called passive. So if you're looking at a poster that's just visual, even if you're watching a video and it's both visual and auditory, you're still passively taking in the information. It's not kinesthetic, it's not that engaging. And so that is where we got an idea that maybe we could do something a bit different. So in the meantime, after those data were collected by USDA, there became an industry-wide expectation that there should be annual continuing education in cow handling. So 99% of dairy farms in the US participate in the Farm Animal Care Program. So it's the industry-wide national standard that sets a minimum bar for animal care expectations. So the current version, which came into effect in January 2020, states that anyone on the farm who directly handles animals, whether they grew up on the farm or are a family member, or whether they're an outside hired employee, needs to show annual documentation of continuing education on stockmanship. So that's what I've highlighted here, which is just another way of saying cattle handling. So at this present time, what constitutes training is totally open-ended. So it could be watching a video or having an outside trainer come in or job shadowing. And so it can be anything as long as it's documented that everybody is getting this annual refresher. So earlier I mentioned I was a bit surprised when Wisconsin farmers said they would like more training on cow handling because we know that there are a lot of good resources out there with excellent information. And the principles around cow handling are very well established. So here I've reproduced a diagram from one of Dr. Temple Grandin's books. So we know a lot about how we can learn to understand cows' natural behavior and leverage that to move them using our body language. So understanding what is the flight zone, the point of balance, etc. But at the same time, we know that people tend to struggle to apply these concepts accurately. And so I think that there is a way to bridge this gap between the knowledge and the application by using more interactive training. And so just really quick as an example of this low stress handling, I want to show a video from a different program that we're developing. And so this is footage captured in the milking parlor of our research dairy for UW-Madison. And this is my graduate student, Monica Ruiz Ramos, and she is relatively new. And so this is actually the first time these cows have ever seen her. And people often have this stereotype that cows on the research dairy are very used to human handling, and therefore they have no flight zone. They're going to be very stubborn, and you'll have to use a lot of force to get them to move. But as you can see in this video, that isn't true. So these cows haven't been trained by Monica. They're just seeing her for the first time, but she's demonstrating this concept called walk back by, where in the parlor, you walk in a circle counter to the direction of cow movement. And this takes advantage of their flight zone of point of balance and causes them to move just using their natural behavior. And so you can see it's working perfectly. This was the first take. And so it just goes to prove that these principles do work. And oftentimes people need a refresher and they need a chance to practice. And then they can see with their own eyes that this actually works. And so what we decided to do to create an innovative, more active and kinesthetic experience for people to practice this kind of concept is to create a video game. And so this is a digital educational video game that works kind of like a flight simulator, and it's called Moving Cows. So it lets people practice routine cow handling in this simulated environment, which doesn't replace hands-on in-person practice, but is much more active and engaging than a passive way of learning, such as watching a video. So the overall learning objectives in the game, what we want people to understand is that if you use inappropriate handling practices, such as yelling or waving your arms and making sudden movements, that this increases the cow's fear and stress responses. And we know that this causes a physiological response that then reduces milk yield. And we also know that when cows are having this fear and stress response, it activates their fight or flight response, and it can cause them to panic and behave in more unpredictable ways that can then threaten the safety of their human handlers. So within the game, we have some more nuanced learning objectives around the flight zone, the point of balance, and some of those mechanics around how you actually do that dance with a cow. But these are sort of the big picture take-home messages about why proper cow handling is important. When we look into the scientific literature about games and learning, we can see that games have been used in other contexts. And these are not always video games. They can be, or they can be role play or other types of games. And we see that these are used in contexts such as in military and professional training, as well as in classrooms for kids of various ages, and also to help people learn about what's called health behavior. So this is things like proper hand washing or safe medication use. And the reason we think that games work well is because they are engaging and interactive, and it can give people a chance to apply concepts and practice skills. So not just taking it in passively, but to actually practice. And so research has shown that compared to more conventional instruction, such as lectures or watching videos, games offer better learning and retention of knowledge. So as we were creating this game, we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just ideas coming from within the university that were created in a vacuum. We really wanted to make sure this would be relevant to our Wisconsin dairy stakeholders. And so we went through this iterative design and development process involving people in the Wisconsin dairy industry to make sure the game would be useful. So we contracted with this local educational game programming company called Filament Games. So they specialize in education games, not just entertainment games. And so we brought the subject matter expertise about dairy cow behavior and dairy farming, but they have skills not just in the computer programming, but also principles around game design. So first they created a prototype for us and we gave internal feedback as a research group. And then they refined it into a second prototype that we then took out to get feedback from our stakeholders. And so here I just have some example screenshots of what that second prototype looked like. So it was fairly rudimentary, and that was really deliberate because we didn't want to take a finished product out and have people say, "Oh, what do you think of it?" And it would be too late at that point to make meaningful changes. And so at this rough draft stage, we wanted to get their input so that we could then incorporate more substantial and meaningful changes if we needed to. And so the process was we identified some local Wisconsin dairy stakeholders and we engaged them in focus groups. And so I came and made introductions, but then I made sure to leave so that people could feel free to speak completely honestly and not feel like they had to say nice things to please me. So we started with a group of 4 professional trainers on campus who teach researchers how to handle animals such as cattle when they're conducting research. And then we also had 3 other focus groups on campus, which included dairy farm owners, bilingual consultants who spoke English and Spanish, as well as dairy veterinarians. And then we traveled to 2 of the farms whose owners participated. And there we worked only with direct employees, so not the owners. And we separated them by the farm and the language, either English or Spanish, as well as their role. So we didn't have any direct supervisors and their reports in the same groups, again, to reduce that peer pressure. And we also had some separation by a shift just for logistical reasons. And so what we did was we had people play the game, and then we recorded these focus group discussions and had them professionally transcribed and translated. And then we went through that feedback to try to pick out themes that we could incorporate into improving this game. And so I'm just going to give 3 examples here. There was much, much more, but one example of a way to improve the game mechanics was that here's a screenshot of what this level of the game looked like. And the character just appeared in the middle of the pen. And many people said they couldn't tell what the objective was and where they had to go. And so they suggested to have the character start at the gate to the pen, because in real life, when you're doing your job and you need to bring the cows out of the pen, you would start at the gate, and that would help orient you. They also suggested zooming out to show the entire environment so they could see what's the layout of the pen, where are all the cows. So we did incorporate both of those changes. Another example of feedback about the game's learning objectives is this message about reducing cow stress. So we know in real life that one of the stress responses that cows show is that they defecate more. And so this theme came up again and again. It was one of the most common pieces of feedback. People asked for more manure in the game as an indicator of cow stress. So one direct quote was, "The dirtier your character is, the worse job you did." So in real life, we know that if you get covered in manure because you're causing a lot of chaos and cow stress, this can be a kind of visual feedback to you. And so we did try to incorporate that to a certain extent as well. And then just an example of how to make sure the art was relevant. So we use the word relevant and not necessarily realistic because this is a game and it needs to be fun and appealing. So for example, these cows have a body condition score of more than 5 on a 5-point scale, and that is deliberate to make them kind of cute and appealing and fun. But we also wanted to make sure that it was relevant to a real life dairy farm. And so people were asking us to add water troughs for these virtual cows and cow brushes, which is lovely from an animal welfare perspective, as well as salt blocks. And so we did all of that. So we incorporated this feedback into a third draft or third prototype. And then internally, I checked that to make sure that all of the feedback we had gotten, which we could implement, was implemented appropriately and was working well. And then we had a final version of the game, which was completed earlier this year in 2023. But we kept that private for research purposes, but I'll just skip ahead to the end. We are going to have a version for public release very soon. So within this final version of the game, I showed you this diagram earlier talking about the main learning objectives. So one of these learning objectives is that when you handle cows inappropriately, it increases the cow's fear and stress responses, which can decrease milk yield. So there are 8 levels in the game, and at the end of each level, people get this scorecard. So here's just an example. And so on the left side, they get a summary of how much cow stress they caused during that level. So that's cumulative for the whole pen of cows. And then you can see in the middle, there's a bulk tank. And so what they see is this dotted line here, which if they cross that threshold, they earn this extra gold star. So out of a theoretical 100% milk production, the more cow stress you cause, the lower the percentage of milk production you achieve relative to this theoretical maximum. So in addition to this feedback about milk production, at the very end of the game, if you successfully complete all 8 levels, then you get a certificate of completion. And so this is saved as an image on your device, but it can be printed out and kept as documentation for this annual continuing education in cow handling. So it can be used to fulfill the requirements of the farm program. So now I just want to show some examples of what the levels in the final version of the game look like. So this is one of the milking parlor levels. And you can see here my character is doing this walk back by movement that I showed earlier in that video of Monica doing this in real life. And so you're walking in a circle counter to the cow movement to get them to load in the parlor without touching them or without making a sound. We also have a couple of levels in a freestall pen. And so this is an illustration of how to use the cow's point of balance to get them to leave the feed bunk. And then here in the same level is how you would get a cow to stand up and exit a freestall. And so you can see here now there are water troughs, there are cow brushes, there are some cow patties. But here we're just illustrating how to use the cow's natural behavior. But there are also options to use negative actions, and you get some feedback on that. So in terms of specific benefits of a video game, so thinking about visual learners, you can use visualization or what's called augmentation within this digital animation to help convey concepts that are hard to picture in real life. So this is illustrating how some cows have smaller flight zones, some cows have larger flight zones, and those are more fearful animals. So even when you're not as close to them, they'll naturally start moving away from people. Another benefit of a video game is that you can get immediate feedback on your actions. So I'll show here an example of somebody approaching a cow and using a negative action like yelling. Your stress level and the cow's stress level went up. And so in this case, there are many types of feedback. So the cow has a stress indicator. If you use an action that affects her or any cows within the vicinity, there's also this cumulative cow stress throughout the level. And then here in the tutorials, there's some words describing what happened and what you might do differently in the future. Another benefit of a video game compared to even real life training is that you can mimic certain challenging situations that are hard to create due to constraints such as time, cost, or safety. So for example, we know that there can be cows who are in heat or in estrus, and this causes them to behave more erratically than your sort of typical average cow. And so we actually incorporated this into the game. So here you can see this cow running in from this direction as I'm trying to move some other ones. And so this is a scenario that we can create in a game. One other consideration I wanted to mention is accessibility. So we know that there has been this demographic shift and that language can be a potential barrier to effective training. So from the get-go, we wanted to design the game with a diverse set of end users in mind that might have variability in their preferred language as well as their literacy levels. And so we had to consider, how do we make sure that it's linguistically appropriate? Are we using the right terminology? Are we using the appropriate language? And also, how do we consider this variability in formal education or literacy, as well as make sure that any references or examples are culturally relevant and resonate with our end users? So we worked with the language access group within University of Wisconsin-Madison's Division of Extension to make sure that we were considering all of these accessibility elements. So the final game is available both in English and Spanish, and users can toggle between those languages at any time during the game. And so here's just an example of one of the parlor levels. So you're seeing the tutorial text in Spanish here. And we kept written text to a minimum. So there is some tutorial language there, but anything that's written on the screen is also narrated. And so we have voiceover narration of everything in both languages. And so that addresses both visual and auditory aspects. And then also at the beginning of the game, people can choose between 6 preset characters that have different skin tones, hairstyles, outfits. And some of the scientific literature suggests this can help people self-visualize, which may improve their ability to identify with what they're doing in the game. So after we completed this first version of the game, like I said, we kept this internal for research purposes. And that was because we thought it was important to not just create the game, but also test to see if it was effective so that we could provide some evidence that people actually get something out of doing it. So we went to 3 new farms who hadn't previously given us feedback on the draft of the game, although their owners had participated in those earlier focus groups. So we had them complete a questionnaire, then they played the game, completed another questionnaire, and then there was a focus group discussion if there was time so that we could make further improvements. But we really wanted to see if they their knowledge on some multiple choice questions about cow handling changed after playing the game. So just to orient you on the demographics, we asked people for their age. So the average here is for everybody who participated. And then we have the data broken out by Spanish and English, and that'll be the same on all of the graphs I'm about to show. So you can see the average age was about 30, and the range was 19 to 55. And then we also asked them how many years they had been working on that current farm. So on average, 5 years, but with a range of 0 years, so totally new people to people who had been there for over 22 years. And this doesn't capture previous experience working in the dairy industry before this farm. So before they played the game, we asked, in general, how much do you enjoy working with dairy cows? So the scale is 1, it's very unenjoyable, to 5, it's very enjoyable. And so again, we show everybody, Spanish speakers and English speakers. And what I want to orient you to is the thick red bars. Those are the median or the average. And then the other pink bars and the whiskers here show the variability. So on average, people thought it was at least fairly enjoyable to work with cows. We also asked them, how good or bad do you believe you are at moving cows to where you want them to go in real life? So on a scale of very bad to very good, on average, people said that they thought they were fairly good at moving cows in real life. And then we also asked them, how safe do you feel when working with dairy cows? So again, making the business case about why this training is necessary. Safety is definitely a concern when working with cows. But on average, people said they felt fairly safe when working with cows. And then we also asked, how comfortable do you feel with using smartphones or tablets? Because this game is played on touchscreen devices, and this is a question we get really often. But on average, people ranked their comfort level as a 4.5 out of 5. So they felt at least fairly comfortable with using smartphones or tablets, although of course there is variation. So then importantly, we assess their knowledge change, and these are descriptive results, no statistical analysis, but you can see here the first bar under each population here is before they played the game, and the second bar is after they played the game. And so the green sections are the proportion of multiple choice questions they got correct. Orange is the proportion they got incorrect, and then they also had an option of just saying, I don't know, to any given question. So you can see that after playing the game, the proportion of questions they got correct went up, and the proportion of questions to which they said, I don't know, went down. So it looks as though their knowledge improved and their confidence also improved. There are some methodological considerations because this was multiple choice. And so we're not sure if people were still getting some questions incorrect because they didn't learn the concept from the game, or if it's because the way we phrase the question. And also, we don't know if this improvement in knowledge translates into a change in behavior in real life. So that's a topic for future research. So after people played the game, we asked them, how enjoyable did you find the game? Because this is a reflection of their engagement. And so on a scale of 1 to 5, from very unenjoyable to very enjoyable, the median was a 4. So people found it fairly enjoyable on average. We also asked, how easy or challenging did you find the game overall, from very easy to very challenging? And here the average is a 2.5. So they found it somewhere between fairly easy and neither challenging nor easy. And I think this is pretty good because we don't want it to be so easy as to be boring or so challenging as to be frustrating. We also asked, how often would you want to play the game again in the future, between never or all the time? And the average was a 3 or occasionally. And I think that's pretty good because the idea is that we would want people to use this for annual continuing education. So if they're willing to play it at least once a year, they could use it to fulfill the farm program requirements. And then lastly, in two separate questions, we asked, how useful do you think the game would be? Imagine two different types of people. So first, imagine someone with little to no experience working with dairy cows, like a new person. So how useful could the game be for them to learn how to handle cows? So on average, people gave it a 4 out of 5. So very useful for a new person. And then we asked them, imagine someone who already has experience working with dairy cows. How useful do you think the game would be for them to review handling practices? So thinking about this annual continuing education. And on average, people also gave it a 4 out of 5. So very useful for an experienced person. So I also thought that that was good news, that this could potentially be used not just for onboarding, but also for this annual refresher. So in terms of where we are now in this project, we were grateful to receive additional funding from the Wisconsin Dairy Innovation Hub, which allowed us to expand testing to new audiences, which I won't talk about today, but also to incorporate some of this additional feedback and data that we collected to make further improvements to the game. So this first version of the game that I just discussed took on average about 36 minutes for people to complete, but with a range from 22 minutes to 55 minutes, which we think is too long to be feasible for real training scenarios on a dairy farm, knowing that time is a constraint. So with this second version now, we wanted to target game completion in under 30 minutes. And so now on average, it takes people 27 minutes to complete the game, but with a range of 20 minutes to 39. So I think it's much better. We also streamlined how people actually move the character to make it a little bit easier to use. And it will be available for both Android and Apple devices. And so the great news is that it's going to be released publicly into both the Apple and Google Play app stores for use on Apple and Android devices. And so this is going to happen in the next 1 to 2 months, and it will be free. And so anybody can just download this onto their phones or tablets. And then the last thing is, as we were doing all these focus groups, we collected ideas for people who work on dairy farms for how a game could potentially help people learn to handle different types of cow handling scenarios. So not just this basic movement of cows to the parlor or loading them into the parlor. And so we had some pre-existing notions that we imagined for how a game could be used. But it's a good thing that we asked, because a lot of employees said that they felt less confident and less safe dealing with the maternity or calving pens. And so they asked for a simulation of that kind of scenario. And so that would be a top priority for future scenarios in the game. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Here is my contact information. So if you do think of questions after the fact that we weren't able to address today, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, the game will be publicly released for free in the next 1 to 2 months. So stay tuned for news about that.